So today I want to talk about my experience using the Sony FX3 for a week. Now, a lot of you guys know this about me. I have been shooting with primarily Canon cameras, really for the majority of my creative career. Now, I did start on Nikon way back in the day, but in 2017, I transitioned over from Nikon to Canon, and really ever since then, I've been shooting on Canon cameras. I'm currently using the Canon R3. A lot of you guys know this. I've made a bunch of videos on the R3, and spoiler alert, I have more videos to come. I absolutely love that camera, and it's really been a perfect camera for my hybrid photo plus video shooting workflow. It's been a fantastic stills camera, a phenomenal video camera, and really just a great all-in-one package to accomplish everything I've needed in my creative career up until now. But recently, as I've been creating more content for this YouTube channel and honestly just shifting a bit in my professional career more towards video and away from the photography-centric aspect of my work, I've been really interested in checking out some more cinema cameras and cameras that are really designed and geared for video, which my R3 is not. The R3 is a very capable video camera, but it's not a video-centric camera. And so when LensRentals gave me the option to try out the Sony FX3 for a week, I jumped at that opportunity. Now, just a quick note here on LensRentals. They are not officially sponsoring this video, as in like they didn't pay me to make this video, but they did allow me to use the FX3 for a week, and so I just want to mention them here real quick. LensRentals has been my go-to for renting camera gear ever since 2017 when I made that shift from Nikon to Canon. I had a big, really important trip planned, and I didn't have a lot of Canon lenses, and in fact, I think I just had one lens, and so I rented all the lenses I needed for the trip from LensRentals, and ever since then, they have been my absolute go-to for anything camera rentals. Now, I'm a huge advocate for renting camera gear, whether that's just to literally try something out like I did with the FX3, or maybe you have a job where you can't justify purchasing a camera or a piece of camera gear just for that one job, but you really need that piece of gear for the job. Renting that gear is a fantastic way to do so, and LensRentals is a phenomenal place to do that. So a huge thank you to LensRentals for partnering with me on this video. They did give me a discount code. If you use the code Rexford15 at checkout, you will get 15% off of your rental order, and that'll also help my channel out a little bit, so feel free to use that code when you rent your gear next time. And if you haven't already, check out LensRentals. They're fantastic. A huge thank you to them for partnering with me on this video. All right, let's chat FX3. So the first question I want to answer is why I rented the FX3 specifically. There's a ton of different cinema cameras out there to choose from. Why specifically the FX3? So the first reason I went with the FX3 is because I knew I wanted a camera that had a full frame sensor. Now, I have nothing against APS-C sensors, and I'm really interested in checking out the Canon C70, but the Canon C70 is an APS-C or Super 35 sensor, and because I'm shooting on the R3 currently, I wanted a camera that was at least comparable in sensor size to the R3. Now again, the Canon C70 is a super attractive camera, and LensRentals, if you're watching this and want to hook me up with a C70 for a week, that'd be amazing. I'd love to do a review on that camera, but I really wanted a camera that had a full frame sensor so I could compare it a little bit more closely to my R3. Now, for reasons I'm not going to go into in this video, I didn't want to go with the R5C. I think that's a great camera. I just don't want to use that for the purposes of this video. And I really didn't want a much larger camera like one of the big Canon cinema cameras. And honestly, I really wanted to check out the Sony ecosystem in general. I've never really shot on Sony. I've shot on almost every other brand other than Sony. And so I really wanted to check out Sony cameras in general. I wanted to check out the FX3 specifically because I knew it was a small, lightweight, compact cinema camera with a full frame sensor. And I've heard really, really good things about this camera. I have friends who shoot with it and have said nothing but good things. And so the FX3 felt like the perfect camera to test out, see if it fit into my workflow, see how I liked it compared to my R3, and just do some comparisons on a camera that's really designed for video versus a camera like the R3 that's designed a little bit more to be a hybrid camera. So I went with the FX3, and I've used this camera extensively over the week that I had it. I shot a ton of stuff around town. I live in a really beautiful town on the shores of Lake Michigan, and so I went out in the morning and did some stuff along the big pier and the boardwalk, and then I went out again at sunset and shot some stuff on the river and down at the state beach, just some candid stuff around town with the camera there. I also shot a short film on the FX3. It's a short film all about my son Everett, and it was just fun to use this camera to capture some fun personal stuff of my own life and honestly just work in a different way than I typically would with couples, with clients, anything like that. And so if you haven't checked out that film, I'll link that below so you can check that out. It's just a 2-minute little short film, but it's really, really cute, and it's all shot on the FX3. And then the final way I tested out this camera was I actually took a trip to Chicago. I asked my friend Jordy, who also shoots with the FX3, to come along with me, and I linked up with a couple that I'm actually working with later this year in Oregon. They're local to Chicago, and I asked them if they'd just be willing to come out, be in front of the camera, kind of model for this shoot, and allow me to put the FX3 through its paces in a little bit more of a familiar environment for me, working with a couple, working in the middle of a city, working in a job that's not super high pressure because I'm not actually booked for anything, but in a little bit more of a familiar aspect to me as a wedding photographer and filmmaker. So first impressions of the FX3 right out of the box, this camera is super small and lightweight. I was really impressed by that. It's one of the things I've honestly been impressed with Sony in general, is how much smaller and lighter their cameras tend to be than the Canon cameras that I'm typically used to using, especially compared to my R3. The FX3 was super lightweight, and I really appreciated that when I'm carrying it around for a whole day. Compared to the R3, this camera is really lightweight. Now, one thing off the bat, I've heard this from other FX3 users as well, the LCD screen felt a little bit loose and flappy compared to like my R3 and my R6. I don't know if this is just a thing on the FX3 that I had, but I think I've heard this on YouTube as well. It wasn't a huge issue in terms of filming, but it just felt like the build quality of the screen specifically was a little bit lacking. But other than that, the camera felt really well built, and I loved all those hardpoint mounting options. Can definitely see myself using this if I was to rig this camera out for larger commercial jobs down the road. Just being able to mount things directly onto the camera would be super convenient. So in terms of ease of filming, this camera was honestly really fantastic. The overall operation of this camera was super easy. I loved having the tally lights, those little red lights that light up whenever you were recording. Now, I did turn off those lights when I was filming downtown Chicago. I didn't want to have the camera in someone's face and have them automatically know that I was filming, so I turned those lights off when I was filming in Chicago. But having the option to have those lights on is a fantastic tool. Another thing I really loved about the FX3, and I think this is true across all Sony cameras, is just how much information they show on screen when you're filming video. This is a huge win over a camera like the R3, where you have to choose between zebras and peaking. On the FX3, you can have zebras and peaking. For whatever reason, on the R3, as soon as you click record for video, the histogram disappears. On the FX3, the histogram shows up live. And to have a live readout of where my exposure was set so I could know if I was a stop over, a stop under, was really helpful from a video perspective. This is stuff I wish Canon included on their cameras. I don't know why they don't. It doesn't make any sense to me, but it was really welcome on the FX3. Another thing that's an absolute game changer with Sony, specifically over Canon, is the ability to apply LUTs to your footage so that when you're filming in log, you can actually see what your footage will look like once you convert it later. Again, this is not something that Canon offers. I don't know why, but basically, if you want this on Canon, you have to use what they call View Assist, which just kind of applies a little bit of a conversion to the footage to show you a little bit closer to what it's going to look like, but I always find it's a little bit brighter than it should be. It just doesn't look quite right. And the only alternative for that on typical Canon cameras is to use something like an Atomos, where you can load the LUT into the monitor. With Sony, that's built directly into the hardware of the camera. So for video, the Sony FX3 was incredibly easy to use. There was so much information at my fingertips as a videographer to know exactly where I stood exposure-wise, to know where my focus was, to know what the histogram was looking like, and to get a really clear readout of what my footage was going to look like once I got it back into the computer. In terms of the autofocus of the FX3, it felt really solid. I think compared to my R3, I liked the FX3's autofocus better when I was just kind of hand-holding, run-and-gun, vlog-style shooting with it. I felt like it automatically locked on to the subject that I wanted to film a little bit quicker and a little bit more accurately than my R3 did. But that being said, I felt like the R3 did a better job when I tried to specifically target something. For instance, if I tapped on the screen on the R3 and the FX3 to track a specific subject, I felt like the R3 did a better job at locking onto that subject and holding that focus than the FX3 did. Now, was it a deal breaker? I don't think so. It was still very accurate on the focus, but it was definitely a little bit less accurate and a little bit less snappy than what I was used to on the R3. So now let's talk about image quality. And honestly, I was really impressed with the image quality of the FX3. Now, compared to the camera I'm typically used to using, which is the R3 actually has a 6K sensor and it's downsampling the footage to 4K versus the FX3 just shoots natively at 4K. And honestly, I didn't notice a huge difference in terms of sharpness or clarity between the R3 and the FX3. Honestly, I think both cameras performed really well, and I was really impressed with the actual readout of the FX3. Now, that being said, the FX3 actually has a dual base ISO sensor, so you can shoot at a native ISO of 800 or a native ISO of 12,800, which is something the R3 doesn't do. This meant that for low light performance, the FX3 absolutely dominated the R3 in terms of how clean the picture looked when you were shooting in low light. And to make things better, I actually mapped that button on the back of the FX3 to switch between those dual base ISOs. And so when I moved inside, I was able to just click one button, switch the native ISO to 12,800, and be totally ready to have a clean, beautiful image indoors, just like I was if I was going to go outside in brighter light. Okay, let's talk about color profiles between Sony and Canon, because this is something I thought I was really going to notice a difference in, and honestly, I didn't notice as much of a difference as I thought I would. And while I could definitely see a difference in the color shift between the two sensors, I was honestly really happy with the Sony colors. I felt like the footage on the FX3 looked really true to life, and I was honestly really impressed overall by the color science of the FX3. Now that being said, I felt like the tonality on the auto white balance on the FX3 felt a little bit cooler and a little bit more magenta compared to the R3. The R3 felt a little bit warmer and a little bit greener overall. I don't know if that's true across the board with Sony and Canon, but that's just what I felt when I was filming. And so on the FX3, I found myself shooting in Kelvin a lot more, and then I actually applied a very specific white balance adjustment where I just bumped the actual tonality of the image just a little bit to get it to match more with my R3. And then once I did that, I was really, really happy with the overall color coming out of the FX3. So overall, I was honestly really impressed with the FX3. It honestly checked all the boxes that I was looking for a very portable, light, video-centric cinema camera that would fit really well into my workflow as a videographer. Now, a few comparisons here between the FX3 and the R3. I feel like as a video camera, the FX3 was much better. Part of that is just that it's a Sony camera, and I feel like Sony really excels in the video market compared to Canon. All of those on-screen displays, the ability to have peaking and zebras and histogram and all that on the screen, the ability to import LUTs into the camera, all of that stuff that Canon doesn't offer on their typical cameras like the R3. And so I was really appreciative of those on the FX3. Now that being said, I know I'm not doing a direct comparison here between a Canon cinema camera and a Sony cinema camera, so it's not a total one-to-one comparison, but I do know that Sony has a lot more video features just natively on their cameras than Canon does, and I really appreciate that approach as a videographer. Now as a photo camera, that's where the R3 really takes the cake. The R3 was meant to be a stills camera that has some incredible video features as well, while the FX3 was meant to be a video camera that can also take some photos. Now I did take some stills on the FX3, and I was pretty happy with the stills that came out of the camera. 12 megapixels is definitely not something I would want to deliver to a client, but it's definitely a passable image if I was to use this camera for travel or just some random photos around the house or something like that. This camera would definitely perform okay as a stills camera, but the R3 definitely knocks it out of the park with a much higher resolution sensor, a better autofocus system, and the EVF for photography. So final takeaway here, will I buy an FX3? Honestly, I think yes, but eventually. As I see my work transition more and more towards video, the FX3 and really just cinema cameras in general are becoming more and more appealing, and the FX3 seems like a really perfect entry line into cinema cameras. Now I know this camera doesn't have built-in NDs, and there's some additional features that it doesn't have that higher end cinema cameras do, but for a very small, very portable, very capable cinema camera, the FX3 seems like the perfect solution for my needs moving forward. Now that being said, you're not going to see an FX3 on my shelf for a little bit here because currently I have exclusively Canon gear and I would have to buy all new Sony glass to be able to use the FX3. Now someone did tell me about the little Sigma mount that allows you to use Canon EF lenses on the Sony mirrorless mount. If any of you guys have experience with that mount, feel free to let me know your experience with that or DM me on Instagram. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that adapter because that would definitely help the transition and make things a little bit easier as I transitioned to also having an FX3 in my arsenal. But I think for the time being, I'll stick with my R3. It's a fantastic camera. It's definitely achieving the job that I want it to at the moment, but the FX3 is definitely on my wish list as a fantastic entry level into cinema cameras for the future. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the Sony FX3. I really enjoyed using this camera, and a huge thank you again to LensRentals for letting me use this for the week. If you have any specific questions about the FX3 that I didn't mention in this video, feel free to drop those down below. I'm definitely not an FX3 or a Sony expert, but I would love to help you out if I can. So feel free to drop those down below, and I will see all of you guys in the next video. Peace. What do you think of the camera, buddy? Yeah, that's my microphone. So yeah, if you haven't checked out that short film, definitely do so. He's super cute. Do you want to say hi? Can you say hi? Just likes the microphone. Okay. Bye, guys.